Hi everyone, this is lecture 5.2, the women's movement. So, in this lecture we'll be defining the women's movement, we'll be talking about the three waves of feminism, and then there is one bullet point missing. We will be discussing some of the associated concepts here. This is a lecture on feminism. One of the reasons why I call it and I label it the women's movement is because people have such weird emotional baggage tied up with this term feminism, and a lot of people say, oh, feminism, who needs that? But if you talk about the women's movement, people are like, oh, what's that about? What do women need? That sort of thing. It's just there's a lot of baggage tied up with this word feminism, and we'll explore a little bit in this lecture. So, let's talk about it. Feminism is the belief in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes, and the social movements organized around that belief. Feminism is also known as the women's movement. Sometimes it's called women's liberation, and in some more dated, older literature, or if you're talking to like an older person, they might call it women's lib, which is it's just a dated term for it. Now, in the United States, feminism is often misunderstood. There are just a number of untrue things that people believe about feminism. People believe that feminists want to take away the rights of men. People believe that all feminists believe the same thing, which is absolutely not true. There's a lot of argument amongst feminists, and that argument's generally seen as a good thing. It's like academia, right? We discuss things to make them make more sense. People believe that feminists hate men, which isn't the case. People believe sometimes that all feminists are lesbians. There's a lot of weird homophobia tied up with negative attitudes toward feminism. People believe that feminism has nothing to offer men, and that can be tied to historic stances in feminism, which we'll talk about later. And people believe that men can't be feminists, and that also is sometimes tied to previous discussions in older versions of feminism that have been dismissed. So, feminists often disagree with each other over what exactly feminism is and what exactly the women's movement is. When I teach Soc 101, I give the very basic definition that feminism, as I just gave you, is the belief that men and women should be treated equally. And that is a good starter definition. But feminists do disagree with each other over the exact definition of feminism. And part of that has to do with the philosophy of the individual engaging in the concepts. A more aggressive, a more radical version of that is that feminism is a struggle to end sexist oppression, and that it's a more social movement, more action-oriented definition than the more, I say conformist without emotion, more centrist concept, that the belief that men and women should be treated equally, right? If you want to persuade someone to be a feminist, you tell them believe men and women should be treated equally. If you want to persuade someone who you're pretty sure is a feminist that they should do more, you use the definition feminism is a struggle to end sexist oppression. And that second definition brings up conversations of so a feminist has to be an activist, right? We live in a male-dominated society, so thus if you accept that second definition, you are advocating for social change, and potentially very radical social change, because if you accept that we live in a sexist society, and the social structures built up in our society are built to benefit men, then the only way to fix it is to break down those social structures and rebuild them. And that kind of talk of social change can be really intimidating to someone who isn't familiar with the idea in the first place. This slide shouldn't be here, sorry about that. There's another conversation. Is feminism inherently political? The more centrist view is that not necessarily. Anyone of any political persuasion can be feminist, and you don't even have to be political. But then, again, the more radical, the more activist feminist would say it absolutely has to be political. It can't be neutral. And those same people would probably make the argument that feminists cannot be Republican either. Uh, it's safe to say the vast majority of people who call themselves feminists are Democrats or leftist in some way. Um, but there are a handful of Republicans that do call themselves feminists. And that ties very closely into the next bullet point. Can you be against abortion and still be feminist? The majority of feminists consider women to have a right to choose to end a pregnancy, right? But there are some who don't agree with that. Well, what does that mean? Do you have to agree that women have a right to control what's happening in their bodies in that way? Can you not think abortion should be legal and still be a feminist? These are big conversations that are had amongst feminists. Now let's talk about these three waves of feminism. In the United States, the women's movement, feminism, is divided into three waves. It is interesting to note that most of the misconceptions regarding feminism are tied to second wave feminism. So when people have bad ideas about feminism, when people don't understand how feminism works, it's often because they have misconceptions about second wave feminism, because it was very abrasive. So First Wave Feminism was the earliest period of feminist activism. It occurred from the 1800s to about 1920. And it ended in 1920 because that's when women got the right to vote. And the major issue in First Wave Feminism was women's suffrage, women's right to vote. Other issues involved there were access to birth control and abortion. Abortion was also still an issue in First Wave Feminism. But it is important to note that abortion was completely illegal and completely underground in back alleys during the first wave era. They tried to change that, but they didn't within their era. Additionally, birth control was very hard to access. You had to often get a hard to attain prescription for birth control, as opposed to today where a doctor will just give it to you. In that era, you had to be a married woman. You had to know what doctor would give it out. You had to undergo like an interview to get it. It was ridiculous by modern standards. Prohibition was also an issue that first wave feminists fought for. During this era, it was completely socially acceptable for men to beat their wives, and domestic violence was a major issue. But first wave feminists felt that it was, if they could stop the flow of alcohol, then they could try to curb domestic violence. That's historically rather interesting because we often think of feminists as being people who also typically think that you should be able to use marijuana, for example. So to talk about a feminist and to talk about them not wanting you to be able to consume a substance, that seems counterintuitive, but it made sense in the era. First wave feminists also did a lot of work to stop child labor, to help get kids out of factories and off of farms, and enable them to have elementary school educations, for example. Second wave feminism occurred in the decades of the 1960s and 70s. Second wave feminism was associated with issues of equal pay for equal work. So effectively, women being able to do any job that a man could do. Remember, the 60s and 70s were the era when women were entering the workforce, and there was a lot of hesitation there for women to be able to do those jobs. Title IX is closely tied with second wave feminism. Title IX, we often think of it as being associated with sports, but it's more than sports. It's about giving equal access to education opportunities to women. And the reason why we think of it as being so closely tied to sports is because sports often have scholarships associated with them. The Equal Rights Amendment is another piece of legislation that was attempted during Second Wave Feminism. The Equal Rights Amendment would have made it illegal to pay men and women different amounts of money for the same job. That never actually passed, and that never actually went through. Many other countries have passed equal rights amendments, but we never actually did as a country. It is one of our major failings as the United States. Additionally, access to abortion was a major issue in second wave feminism. Part of that is because the Roe v. Wade decision that gave women the legal right to have an abortion, that occurred during the 60s and 70s. During that era, it came to prominence, and then the Supreme Court decision was made. Because of that, it was a major rallying cry for second wave feminists. Now, second wave feminism was highly controversial. One of the major reasons why it was so controversial was the great social change that was occurring during that era. So women were going out of the home and going into the workforce, right? That disrupted the institution of the family, that disrupted the institution of the workforce, that disrupted government. Anywhere where women could work, it disrupted, it changed it. And that what made a lot of men very upset. Additionally, second wave feminists were often intentionally abrasive. This is a decision that social movements often make. Are we going to make people angry, or are we going to try to be their friends? And there is a certain benefit to trying to make people angry because it gets attention, but it can also get you negative attention. So they had events such as public bra burnings. They had aggressive protests where they would chant abrasive chants or say abrasive things, all toward the end of trying to get more people to join their movement, not necessarily to persuade people. So some examples of abrasive second wave rhetoric were things like all men are inherently sexist, or marriage is an inherently sexist institution, or something as extreme as every act of penis-vagina intercourse is an act of rape. That last one is certainly not something that modern feminists would go along with, right? Because modern feminists are so much about you being able to have the kind of sex that you want to have. But second wave feminists were more about challenging male power structures, and they perceived sex as being a male-dominated thing. Thus, if they challenged sex, they would also be challenging that power structure. So, while some of these statements may touch on truth, they don't help build solutions, and that's why this kind of stuff was pushed to the side, largely by the following waves of feminism. It just didn't help the movement along. It did a certain job in its moment, but we don't keep doing things like this. So, following second wave feminism and adjacent to second wave feminism, it existed at the same time, was this thing called the men's movement. Existed in the 1970s. It was relatively short-lived, and it was a movement of men that sought to discuss the challenges of masculinity. Just like the women's movement was called women's liberation, this was called male liberationism, but it was short-lived because it quickly split into two groups. It split into what called itself the men's rights movement, and then the pro-feminist men's movement. The men's rights movement were a group of men that felt that feminism created disadvantages for men. They now call themselves meninists, and they remained dormant for decades, but were revived in the mid-2000s surrounding issues of entertainment in video games largely. That was where the internet bit came up. And older things were men's custody issues. So there are legitimate arguments that men are given less power in terms of who gets custody of children in kind of domestic issues. and that actually pushed the men's rights movement for a long time. But a lot of that is often tied in with some pretty deep and ugly sexism, which it's basically what most of us would consider not cool. Um, Additionally, Menonists also seek the right that they call to depict women in degrading ways for entertainment of men. So there were the video game controversy a number of years ago about equal depiction of women in video games, or what is acceptable depiction of women in video games. Is it okay to have women be portrayed in a hypersexual way all the time? That sort of thing. Now, the pro-feminist men's movement they don't still exist, a group of people that feel that sexism harms both men and women, and they wanted to fundamentally change society's ideas about gender. So the pro-feminist men's movement saw what second wave feminism was doing, and they said, hey, women feminists, we see what you're saying here, and we want to try to help. How can we help? And these ideas were eventually heard by second wave feminists, and they were instrumental in creating what became third wave feminism. Third wave feminism is the most recent period of feminist activity. It focuses on women and men having the right to be both masculine and feminine. So third wave feminism, when people say, oh, I'm a man, feminism isn't for me, or oh, I'm a woman, I like men too much, that's what third wave feminism is. Third wave feminism is about being able to be the person that you are and letting other people be the people that they are, as long as we all respect each other, right? That's the thing, right? We can go back and talk about the gender spectrum. I don't think we've talked about that yet. We will talk about it in future weeks regarding gender and sexuality. No, I can't remember when we talk about it, but you'll get it. Additionally, third wave feminists contribute the idea that different people experience gender differently based on their intersectional identities. And that is the origin of that concept of the intersection. That's a third wave feminist concept, and it's the origin of the concept. In addition to the study of gender and sex, several social science concepts came out of third wave feminism. We have the concept of the behavior spectrum, where someone can be extremely masculine or extremely feminine, and many grades in between. That's a third wave feminist concept. The concept of privilege, particularly within third wave feminism, male privilege, where we have taken that to talk about white privilege, to talk about class privilege, to talk about all kinds of other privileges. That is a third wave concept. Intersectionality, also, that we just mentioned, is a third wave concept. Sorry about that. And intersections are, important to note in the women's movement. So, for example, 38% of Latinas do not have health insurance. So, if you are a woman, if you are Hispanic or Latino, and you are at greater risk of having health insurance than a woman who is white. It could be talking about the type of work that you might be doing because of the people you know in the various industries. It could talk about immigration status for the given demographic, right? Additionally, it can be very hard to get an abortion if you are a woman who is Latina. It could be difficult based on the state you're living in. It could be difficult because you don't have that access to health insurance. Winona LaDuke is a woman who is profiled in your readings. The reading in the book gives a very interesting portrait of her as a woman of mixed race, of her as a woman who identifies as being Native American, a mother, and an activist. And I really encourage you to read that particular reading. Of course, it's a science, so you should be reading it anyway. But it shows how her intersectional identities really encouraged her to do the work that she does. And that is it for this lecture. I hope it gave you some things to think about, and I will talk to you soon.